Hello and welcome to this second module in our CA Gen training series with Studio Developer. In this module we will be looking at views which enable us to process or store variables in our action diagram code. Following on from the last module, we have our training model, and I'm going to open the model, which will open the Model Explorer. And if you have a preference set to reopen generators when opening the model, then the generators that you last used, in this case the window generation editor, is automatically opened for me, and we'll see a good reason for that in a minute. Another feature of the Model Explorer is the recently used list, and again there are preferences to help you define what you see in there. So you can specify what type of objects you want to see in the recently used list and how many items are in that list. And this tells me that I recently used the logon procedure step and associated window. So it makes it very easy to pick up where you left off and open the editors for the objects that you want to process. In the last module, our action diagram only contained a single event with a message box, but most data processing programs need to work with variables, and in CA Gen these are called views. You can look at the views by expanding the view sections at the top, or you can open up a separate view maintenance window as well. And views in a Gen action diagram are divided into imports, and that is data coming into the program, exports, which is data leaving the program, locals, which is data that is local or private to this program or action block, and entity action views, which are where you code your database access statements. We'll cover imports, exports, and entity action views in a later module. So for today, we're going to concentrate on local views. In our sample logon application, I'm going to count the number of times that the logon button is pressed. And to do that, I'm going to need a view to store a counter. So I'm going to put it into the local view, and I'm going to add a view, and I'm going to call this temp logon count. So that's the name of the view, and I have to specify the attributes, but attributes within CA Gen are grouped into either an entity type, which again we'll cover in a later module, or a work set. And because this was a brand new model, there are two standard work sets that are available always as part of a new Gen model, and I'm going to pick one called IF supplied, which contains a number of attributes like a count, which is the one I want. So if I click on OK, I have my view temp logon count of the work set IF supplied, and the attribute is count. And then if I want to count the number of times this logon function was invoked, I use a command called set, which is setting an object, in this case a view, to a value. So I'm going to set, and if I start typing in, then there's only one choice, so I can just press enter, and then I want to increment it, so itself plus 1. So there's my logon count incremented, and then maybe I want to tell the user how many times they've pressed the button. So I might want to have a different message for the first time. So if the temp logon count is equal to 1, and then I'll put in an else, and then I'll move. So with that I use F7 or cut and paste and move that function message box there. And then the second time I want to output a different message. So I'm going to copy that one, and I'm going to change this message into, and then it's going to be a formatted string. So what I want to do is concatenate. So I use the concat function. Maybe start with hello, and then a string, and then I want to output the count. And to do that, I'm going to use a number format function. Number format, I'm going to format the logon count. I'll just close this to make it a bit easier to see. And then I have 4 parameters for the format. In this case, I'm going to say it's ZZ. Z is 0 suppressed, so that would be the Z's are replaced by digits if it's more than 10 or 100. And then I'm just going to default the 0 and negative and null values because we're not going to see those. So there's my changed code, which I will save. And then I explained why earlier that you could automatically open the generation windows, and a good reason for doing that is if they're open, then they listen for changes in action diagrams and automatically select the objects that you've changed in other editors for generation. So if I switch to this window, I can immediately press process. I don't have to remember what I've changed. I can just straight away generate the code that I've changed, and I'm ready for testing. So now I'm going to test my logon window, and I press OK, and you'll notice something incorrect. It's saying hello each time. So maybe we're not quite sure why that is. So for more complex examples where you need to trace through the code, one of the features in CAGen is to be able to generate the code with what's called trace or debug support. So I'm going to generate the code with trace support, and then to be able to view the trace I need to start something called the diagram trace utility, and this is another component in CAGen. And then now when I execute my application and press OK, the diagram trace utility allows me to step through my code and inspect views. So the counter is 0, then it's 1, and that's to be expected. And then if I press OK again, you'll see here the counter has been reset back to 0. And the reason for that is this property here of the view to say it's initialized, and that means that every time an event or the procedure step logic is executed, that variable is reinitialized to its default value, which for a numeric attribute is 0. So in this case I don't want it to be reinitialized, so I'm going to change that view to be non-initialized and save that, and now I can regenerate my code. And retest the application, and this time hopefully you can see here it's now working correctly. At this point I'll also bring up the concept of saving the model. When I save if I change the action diagram, maybe add a note in here. When I save the action diagram, it's saving it to the work files, but if I wanted to close the entire model, then any changes I'd made since I last saved the model would not be saved for the next time. So we've got this concept of saving the action diagram to the work files, and then if you want to preserve that model for good, then you need to also save the model. So in our view we had this IEF supplied count, and I mentioned that the workset IEF supplied was inbuilt into a standard CAGen model. You may be wondering why it's called IEF supplied, and that's basically because the original name of the CAGen product was IEF, and this was the workset that was supplied with a default IEF model, hence the name, which hasn't changed along with the name of the product. The workset itself, if I open that up, a workset is essentially nothing more than a collection of attributes, and in the IEF supplied workset we have a flag, which is a single text, a one character text attribute. We have the count that we used, which was a numeric of length 9. We have a command, which is text 80. We have an average currency attribute, which is numeric, length 11 with 2 decimal places. So what you can see here with these different attributes is an attribute in CAGen is not only specifies the domain, which could be text, number, date, time, timestamp, blob, GUI object, but also the length, and it can have various other properties like whether it's optional or mandatory, whether it's case sensitive or not, whether it's varying length or not. And then for numeric attributes you can specify that decimal precision libraries are used for more complex arithmetic calculations, or if you're generating COBOL you can specify what data type this attribute will be generated as. So essentially the attribute is the logical specification of the variable that would then get generated into the generated code for the different languages that CAGen supports. If you need to add more attributes, you could just add them to IEF supplied, but typically what you would do would be to create a workset for the type of data that you want to model. And so I might have a workset of, which I'll call string, and then I might have an attribute text for a long text attribute. So there my workset string has an attribute text, so that's how you can create an attribute. In a subsequent module we'll be talking about how data can also be modeled as an entity type, which is needed if you want to store the data in a database, but a workset is used to specify the definition of an attribute when that data is purely used within a program or passed between programs or passed between action blocks and isn't actually going to be persisted in a database. Just reminding you of the window design for this procedure. This concludes this second module, but if you want some practice, maybe you want to consider adding another button onto the window which would reset this counter. So add a push button onto the window, and then with a separate event action which would reset the logon count to 0. So that may be a practice that you want to work on. Well, that's the first look at views, purely looking at local views, and in the next module we'll expand on that and talk about import and export views.